Katy Perry is one of the best-selling artists of all time. She's a princess of pop with 9 #1 hits. Perry is the first solo female artist to have 5 #1 singles from one album.
There are friendships that the world watches from a distance and believes it understands. Then there are friendships so layered, so real, and so fiercely private that the public version barely scratches the surface. The bond between Sir Elton John and Princess Diana was one of those rare, complicated, deeply human connections that the official story never quite captured. For years, people have seen the highlights, the dancing, the funeral, the tears, the song. But Elton has slowly, carefully, and sometimes painfully peeled back the curtain on what their relationship truly looked like from the inside. What he has revealed is far more honest, more funny, more painful, and more beautiful than anything the royal press machine ever let the world see. To understand the real story, you have to go back to where it began, not in some grand formal setting, but in the middle of a nearly silent disco at Windsor Castle. By the time Elton John arrived at Windsor Castle for Prince Andrew's 21st birthday party in 1981, he was no stranger to royal affairs. The Queen Mother and Princess Margaret had long been admirers of the musician, and he had become a fixture at some of the most intimate royal gatherings. He was comfortable around the family in the way that any seasoned performer learns to be comfortable in rooms full of powerful people, professionally relaxed on the outside, while quietly aware that he did not entirely belong. He was a rock and roll man in a world of ancient protocol, and he knew it. Biography. Before his performance that evening, there was a discotheque in the ballroom, but apparently the Queen had concerns about the noise level, and so the music was turned down to the point where you could almost hear footsteps over it. Elton found himself in the surreal position of trying to look natural while dancing with Princess Anne and then Queen Elizabeth herself, who famously kept hold of her handbag throughout the whole affair. He has described the experience as trying to act like everything was perfectly normal while the world around him had clearly gone a little mad. But then something shifted the entire atmosphere of the night. Lady Diana Spencer walked into the room, and Elton noticed immediately that she operated on a completely different frequency from everyone else there. Yahoo! According to Elton's own account in his 2019 autobiography Me, Diana was blessed with an incredible social ease, a natural ability to make people feel completely comfortable in her company the moment she started talking. They were introduced, and rather than falling into the stiff formality that usually defines such evenings, the two immediately clicked. They ended up pretending to dance the Charleston while laughing at how absurdly quiet the music was. Two people who both loved to laugh and found themselves slightly out of place in the same room. It was the most natural beginning to a friendship that would span 16 years and survive heartbreak, illness, conflict, and ultimately, tragedy. Biography Yahoo! What the world has never fully grasped is just how different Diana was in private compared to the carefully managed image the palace projected. The shy young woman who peered at photographers from beneath her fringe was a performance, not a person. Or rather, it was one small corner of a much larger and far more colorful personality. In conversations with author Craig Brown, Elton described Diana as a real gossip, someone who was incredibly indiscreet, the best dinner party guest you could imagine, because you could ask her anything and she would actually tell you. She did not deal in polite deflection or careful non-answers. She had opinions, she had stories, and she was absolutely willing to share them with someone she trusted. The Royal Observer. Elton has said that this private version of Diana was the one that captured him completely. Behind closed doors, she was sharp, wickedly funny, and had a way of noticing the most absurd details about royal life that nobody else would dare say out loud. She teased him about his extravagant stage costumes and oversized spectacles, and he would repay her by acting out outrageous stories from life on the road. They were, in his telling, like two mischievous schoolchildren who had somehow ended up at the most formal dinner table on earth and were doing their absolute best not to get caught laughing. The friendship was built on a foundation of honesty and humor, which meant it was also built on genuine trust, the rarest thing in the lives of two people who were, at that point, among the most recognized faces on the planet. There was a deeper current running beneath the laughter, though. In his memoir, Elton described how Diana could have a staggering impact on the men around her. Straight men, in particular, seemed to lose their minds entirely in her presence. Utterly bewitched was the phrase he used. He witnessed this phenomenon on multiple occasions, but one particular evening at a dinner party he hosted became the story he could not stop telling. The evening had brought together an extraordinary collection of guests, and among them were two of the biggest action stars in Hollywood, Richard Gere and Sylvester Stallone. Diana was there as well, separated from Prince Charles and very much herself for the evening. The Royal Observer. According to Elton's account, Stallone had arrived at the party with a very specific agenda. he had come with the express intention of spending time with Diana and potentially pursuing her. What he found instead was Diana deep in conversation with Richard Gere, the two of them entirely absorbed in each other. As the evening went on, Elton's husband David Furnish went looking for the two actors when dinner was served, and what he found in the hallway was not at all what he expected. Furnish discovered Stallone and Gere squaring up to each other, apparently on the verge of settling their differences over Diana by having an actual fistfight. Two of the toughest men in cinema, ready to trade punches in a London hallway, over a princess who had barely seemed to notice the brewing storm. Stallone was furious, and after dinner ended with Diana still clearly more interested in Gere's company than his, Stallone reportedly declared that he never would have turned up if he had known that, as he put it, Prince Charming was going to be there. OL+2. Elton has always told this story with enormous affection, not just for its comedy value, but for what it illustrated about Diana's power. She never tried to have that effect on people. She did not work at it or calculate it. She simply walked into rooms and brought out emotions in people that they did not know they had. Stallone stormed out, Diana and Gere kept talking by the fireplace, and Elton sat back and watched with the quiet satisfaction of a man who knew he was witnessing something genuinely extraordinary. The woman who was supposed to be a quiet, obedient member of the royal family had just inadvertently caused Hollywood's two biggest tough guys to nearly come to blows without lifting a finger. But the most important dimension of their friendship was not the gossip or the dinner parties or the celebrity anecdotes. It was the work they did together, and the moral courage they shared, in one of the darkest chapters of the 20th century. By the mid-1980s, the AIDS crisis was devastating communities across the world, and nowhere was the human cost more visible than in the circles Elton John moved in. He was watching friends in the music and fashion worlds die one by one, often in isolation, abandoned by families too frightened or too ashamed to visit. The stigma surrounding the disease was catastrophic, built on fear and ignorance, and it was being reinforced every single day by the silence of people in positions of power who should have known better. Diana refused to be silent. In 2018, Elton spoke publicly about the moment that defined her legacy for him, the day in April 1987 when she opened the UK's first specialised HIV and AIDS unit at the Middlesex Hospital in London and walked up to a patient and shook his hand, without wearing gloves. Elton described it as one simple handshake, one gesture that showed the world the desperate need for humanity for people living with AIDS. She understood, he said, that her gesture meant nobody should be left behind, and that she did not distinguish between people based on who they were or how they had become ill. Huffington Post. Elton has spoken in interviews about how significant it was to have someone from Diana's position take that stand. AIDS was being treated as a gay disease at the time, and for a woman who was straight, and who was part of the royal family, to step forward and demonstrate compassion from the other side was, in his words, an incredible gift. Her involvement helped destigmatize the disease in ways that no awareness campaign ever could, because she reached people who would never have listened to anyone else. Her willingness to sit at the bedsides of dying patients, often without cameras present, often without any public record of the visit, reflected a quality in her that Elton has consistently described as her greatest strength, the ability to look at someone who was suffering and genuinely see herself in them. Yahoo! Her courage inspired him. He has said directly that Diana's work with AIDS patients was the driving force behind his decision to establish the Elton John AIDS Foundation, which went on to become one of the most significant charitable organizations in the global fight against the disease. They became collaborators in a cause that was far larger than either of them, using their fame not as an end in itself but as a tool for something that mattered. For a period in the late 1980s and early 1990s, they were perhaps the two most visible champions of AIDS awareness in the world, and they pushed each other to do more and be braver than either might have managed alone. Which makes what happened next all the more painful to understand. Because the friendship that had survived so much eventually cracked, not over something grand or ideological, but over a book. In his memoir, Elton described how Diana had agreed to write the foreword for a photography book called Rock and Royalty, a collection created by their mutual friend Gianni Versace to raise money for the Elton John AIDS Foundation. The book was ambitious, the cause was one they had fought for together for years, and Elton had put significant resources into making the project happen. Diana had agreed, she had seen the contents, she had expressed enthusiasm, and her involvement was expected. New idea. The book contained photographs of the royal family alongside semi-nude male models, and Diana had agreed to write the foreword and had been shown the full contents in advance. But as the launch approached, everything unraveled. Diana got cold feet. Elton's belief was that Buckingham Palace had made clear that they did not want a member of the royal family associated with a book featuring photographs of men in very little clothing. And so Diana withdrew, not just from writing the foreword, but from attending the launch event entirely. By the time she changed her mind, over $400,000 worth of tickets had already been purchased for the fundraising dinner that was built around her involvement. Biography +2. Elton was devastated and furious. He wrote back to Diana directly, making no attempt to soften his feelings, telling her exactly how much money her last-minute withdrawal had cost the AIDS Foundation. She had seen the book, he reminded her. She had said she loved it. Her claim that she had been unaware of the contents was simply not true, and he said so. Diana's response was brief, cold, and formal in a way that was entirely unlike the woman who had sat with him and laughed and gossiped and trusted him with her most private thoughts. The warm friendship was suddenly behind a wall of royal formality, and neither of them seemed willing to be the first one to climb over it. New idea. What followed was months of complete silence between them. Two people who had spoken regularly, who had been through so much together, who had supported each other through personal crisis and public scrutiny, simply stopped communicating. Elton has reflected on this period many times in the years since, and he is always honest about his own role in it. He was proud. He was hurt. And he waited for an apology instead of simply picking up the phone. He has said it remains one of the genuine regrets of his life, that two people who cared about each other as deeply as they did could let pride build a wall that neither was willing to knock down first. Nicki Swift. The wall finally came down because of grief. On July 15, 1997, Gianni Versace was shot and killed outside his Miami home, and the shock of losing someone they both loved deeply proved more powerful than any argument. Diana called Elton from a boat in the Mediterranean, where she was vacationing with Dodi Fade. She said she was sorry, that their falling out had been silly, and just like that, months of silence dissolved. It was a reconciliation rooted not in negotiation or careful words but in the simple recognition that life was too short and that what they had was worth more than their disagreement. Nicki Swift. 3 weeks later, they both traveled to Milan for Versace's funeral service at the city's cathedral. It was an intensely emotional day, and Elton was overcome with grief. Diana, sitting beside him, reached over and placed her hand on his shoulder to comfort him. Cameras captured the moment and it went around the world, a princess consoling a grieving friend in one of the most public and solemn settings imaginable. But Elton has always made sure to include the detail that Diana's comfort came with a very characteristic touch of humor. Even in that moment, she leaned close and asked if he had a mint. She was desperate for a polo. It was such a perfectly Diana thing to do, finding the tiniest sliver of levity in a heavy moment, not to diminish the grief but to share the weight of it with someone she loved. Smooth radio, smooth radio. They walked out of the cathedral together that July afternoon and made plans to meet in London when they were both back. Elton left Milan feeling a relief he had not experienced in months. His friend was back, the silence was over, and there was time ahead of them to make up for what had been lost. He had absolutely no way of knowing that the afternoon in Milan would be the last time he ever saw her alive. On the morning of August 31, 1997, Elton was at his home in Nice, France, when the news reached him. Princess Diana had been killed in a car crash inside a tunnel in Paris while being pursued by photographers. She was 36 years old. He has described the shock of that morning as something he still cannot fully put into words, the sensation of a reality that made no sense, of a world that had shifted in the night into something unrecognizable. 6 weeks earlier, they had been sitting together, laughing, making plans. And now she was gone. Collider. The grief that swept the world in the days that followed was unlike anything the modern era had seen. And amidst it, a phone call came that would ask Elton to do something that terrified him. It was Richard Branson who approached Elton with the idea, noting that people visiting Kensington Palace to leave tributes were writing out the lyrics from Elton's 1973 song Candle in the Wind, in the books of condolence. With the blessing of the Spencer family, Branson asked Elton to rewrite the song for Diana and perform it at the funeral. Stereogum. The original song had been written about Marilyn Monroe, with the famous opening line Goodbye, Norma Jean. Elton's longtime lyricist Bernie Taupin rewrote it, changing that line to Goodbye, England's Rose, and transforming the song into something entirely new, a love letter to his friend. Elton was terrified. Not of the performance itself, but of failing her. He knew that hundreds of millions of people would be watching from around the world, and that this was not a concert or a televised special or a career moment. It was a final goodbye to someone he had loved, and he had to get it exactly right. Collider. He was so anxious about accidentally reverting to the original words that he had a teleprompter installed beside the piano at Westminster Abbey. He did not want to risk singing Monroe's name instead of Diana's in front of the entire grieving world. On September 6, 1997, he sat at that piano in front of the royal family, dignitaries, and Diana's sons, 15-year-old William and 12-year-old Harry, and he played. He later said that in terms of scale, it felt like the biggest gig of his life, with 4 minutes in which he would be at the center of the world's attention. But in the same breath, he said clearly that it was not an Elton John moment, it was not about him at all. Golf Nusal. He kept his eyes on the keys and the teleprompter and did not allow himself to think about where he was or who was watching. He described it afterward as being in a kind of trance, operating on pure muscle memory and love. He finished without a single error, stood, and quietly walked back to his seat. The silence that followed lasted only a moment before it was replaced by something far more overwhelming. The performance is now considered one of the most memorable moments of the entire ceremony, and it proved wrong the concerns that had existed in some royal circles about the song being too sentimental for such an occasion. Collider. The song was released as a single, and it became the best-selling physical single in the history of recorded music. Every penny of the proceeds went to the Memorial Fund for Diana's charities. But despite its commercial success, Elton has been clear that he has no interest in ever performing that version again. He has not sung it since the funeral, not even at the concert for Diana at Wembley in 2007, where he performed with her sons. He continues to sing the original Marilyn Monroe version at concerts, but the Diana version remains singular and untouched, exactly as it was on the morning of September 6, 1997. He does not want anyone to think he is exploiting it. He wants it to exist only as what it was, a gift of love, given once, to someone who deserved it. Yahoo! In the years after the funeral, Elton turned his grief into purpose. He looked at William and Harry, 2 boys who had been made to walk behind their mother's coffin in front of the entire world, and he made a private promise to himself that he would not disappear from their lives the way so many others had. At Elton's farewell concert at Dodger Stadium in 2022, Prince Harry delivered a message of gratitude, thanking Elton for being the friend he had been to his mother, for being a friend to Harry and Meghan, and for being a friend to their children. That message, from a man who had grown up knowing Elton as a constant presence, said more about the depth of that promise than any interview ever could. Fox News. When Harry and Meghan began facing the kind of relentless press intrusion that had defined and ultimately destroyed Diana's life, Elton did not stay on the sidelines. He stepped forward publicly to defend them, and he provided practical support, paying for private flights to ensure they could travel safely and privately in a way that Diana never had the freedom to do. He said explicitly that he felt a duty to protect Harry from the same forces that had contributed to his mother's death. It was a duty rooted not in celebrity loyalty or public positioning, but in a promise made to himself in the silence of his own grief. Huffington Post. Now, having looked back across more than 4 decades of knowing her, as a young woman who danced the Charleston with him at a quiet disco, as a friend who made him laugh until he was exhausted, as a fellow fighter for people the world had abandoned, as someone he argued with and missed and reconciled with and ultimately lost, Elton John has arrived at what he calls the actual truth about Diana. And it is not the truth of the icon, or the fairy tale princess, or the sainted martyr. It is something far more valuable. She was a real woman. She was funny and imperfect and sometimes politically cautious and occasionally infuriating and always, beneath everything, profoundly kind. She was lonely in the way that only people surrounded by millions of admirers can be lonely. She was brave in ways that cost her personally and never asked for credit. She was the best kind of friend, the kind who told you the truth, made you laugh, and showed up when you needed her. Elton's deepest confession is the simplest one, and also the hardest one to sit with, that he wasted months of the time they had left together because he was too proud to pick up the phone. He has said it plainly in interviews, and he clearly believes that anyone listening should take the lesson seriously. Life does not give you a warning before it ends. Friendships are fragile things, even the great ones, and they require tending. The silence that followed their argument over a book nearly meant that the last exchange they ever had would have been a cold, formal letter rather than a reconciliation in the shadow of their shared grief. That thought, he has said, still haunts him. When Elton sits at his piano today, he carries all of it: the Charleston at Windsor Castle, the dinner party in London, the hospital wards, the arguments, the forgiveness, the funeral, the years of watching her sons become men she would have been so proud of. He has said that he sees Diana's legacy not only in the funds raised or the policies changed, but in the way people learned, slowly, to treat the vulnerable with less fear and more humanity. And he is proud, genuinely and without reservation, that he got to know who she actually was, not the icon, not the royal, but the woman who wanted a polo at a funeral and could reduce Sylvester Stallone to jealous fury without even trying, and who shook a dying man's hand when the whole world was watching and nobody else was brave enough to move. That is the truth Elton John has been telling, quietly and persistently, for years. It does not fit neatly on a commemorative mug or a tabloid headline. It is too human for that, too complicated, too real. But it is hers, and he has carried it faithfully, the way you carry something that belongs to someone you love and can no longer give back to them.